Hey guys, so today I'm doing another reaction video, and um, I do have a confession before I start this, and that is I'm not necessarily a history teacher, but I am in first year of Teachers College for becoming a history teacher. Okay, so I'm gonna be one in literally 2 years, so calm down. And this is my way of learning more about history and asking questions so that I'm very good at my career. So it's a win-win for everyone. You get to learn, I get to learn, we get to learn together, and we can react to some good content. And of course, as always, I'm going to try and provide insightful commentary so it's not just me saying nothing watching a whole video because that's stealing basically, and I don't want to be that kind of guy. Okay, so reacting to Eastern Front animated. The one thing that annoys me about being in learning history in Canada is that you're only learning about Canadian history predominantly. And the problem with that is Canadian history is personally for me kind of boring. I really like geopolitics that are outside of Canada, but I guess this is a reality for anybody, right? If you're going to be learning history in any country under the education system, it's obviously going to be your country first, but that's boring. So let's watch this, react to it, and see what's going on. Eastern Front animated in 1941, so obviously this is going to be Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. So, pretty epic battle. Let's see what happens. Although we already know, historically speaking.
Europe, summer 1941.
Okay, so before we even really jump into this, I think something interesting to really point out is it is insane. People like don't understand that this was only like 80 years ago, maybe a little more, a little over 80 now, but people don't understand like how things have changed, right? How peaceful Europe is compared to now. I know there's obviously the Russian-Ukraine war, but like besides that, Europe is a very peaceful continent. But it's insane to think that before nuclear bombs and all that, Europe was just a war zone, kind of like the Middle East, just back and forth fighting every single 10 years, even less sometimes. But what's really impressive is how a country like Germany, with its small population at the time, I suppose could just dominate Europe the way it has. Like by 1941, of course the Germans thought they were unstoppable. Look at all the land they have. I mean, wouldn't you at this point? Like it's hard for it not to go to your head because especially I mean, Nazi Germany like built itself off the ideology that's naturally superior to basically everyone. But then to have it go so well in 2 years to the point where they own all of Europe and Norway, well, that only confirms their insane ideology. So, in that retrospect alone, the invasion of the Soviet Union does not seem that stupid. It seems rational because the whole Nazi ideology is based off destroying communism, Judaism, and that's all the Soviet Union really is, right? At least it's communism. I don't know how many Jews are in the Soviet Union, though I assume it's a lot. So you can't even blame Germany for assuming that the Soviet Union would collapse upon its invasion because they're so caught up in their own fan fiction. They think they're going to win, and can you blame them? So that's a yeah, I don't know.
Germany had secured most of Central and Western Europe, with only Great Britain remaining defiant on the islands. The only potential threat to Germany in Europe was its former ally, the Soviet Union. In order to break the stalemate with Britain and make Germany's strategic position indisputable, Hitler decided to cripple the military capabilities of the Soviet Union and seize its natural resources. Germany planned to achieve this goal by capturing most of the European part of the Soviet Union before the onset of winter 1941. The main attack would take place in the center and be directed towards Moscow.
Okay, so just to go here too, this like from the perspective of the Nazis, this kind of makes sense because they think they're superior. They think that this is going to be a knockout blow because they're facing off against Britain, obviously, as you see to the left. And as far as they're concerned, if they collapse the Soviet Union, they have no more threats on their land border, and they can completely focus on the United Kingdom. But their one mistake was assuming that the Soviet Union would collapse upon invasion, which didn't happen.
With auxiliary attacks in the north and south.
But I could see the paranoia of like, what if they attack us? I don't know if that was what the Nazi leadership was thinking, but I could see that paranoia for sure. So take them out before they take us out. And obviously, the Nazi ideology was insanely hostile to begin with, right?
By the middle of June 1941, the Germans had almost completed the preparations and the invasion was about to begin. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces were unaware of what was coming and were ill prepared to resist the German invasion. First, we'll look at the southern sector. The Soviets had deployed their strongest units in the south, having 1,200,000 men between the Pripyat marches and the Black Sea. They were to be confronted by the Army Group South that was of roughly the same strength. The first objective of the Axis troops was securing the western Ukraine. On June 22nd, the invasion began. The Soviets immediately gathered their armed forces and met the German spearhead with a massive counterattack in the air.
Okay, so isn't this the largest land invasion in human history to this day? The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union? That's insane when you think about it. People forget how recent and insane World War II was. And this is a really good video that kind of helps you appreciate the epicness of the combat and the brutality of the combat as well. Yeah, I don't know.
Area of Dubno and Brody. But due to the lack of combat readiness of the units involved, it failed, and the Soviets lost most of their tanks. The German advance continued, and this created a threat of encirclement to the Soviet troops in the south, and they had to be withdrawn from the exposed position. After the main attack had tied down the Soviet reserves, the Axis forces in Romania joined the offensive. The main spearhead now made a dash towards the east, and this made Soviet command think that the main German effort was directed towards Kiev. However, the Germans had stuck to their original plan and turned south. When the Soviets realized the German intentions, it was already too late to withdraw their forces, and the Germans encircled and destroyed many of the Soviet formations near the town of Uman. The Soviets now abandoned western Ukraine and retreated to the eastern bank of the river Dnieper. They deployed the first wave of freshly mobilized troops to establish a strong defense on the river line and also cling to the port of Odessa. At the same time, operations were being carried out in the north, where 1.5 million German soldiers from army groups north.
Okay, so one interesting thing to note here is that when we look at the modern Ukraine-Russia war, it's interesting to compare it to the German-Russian war that is happening right now, because it's interesting how quick the Nazis were conquering Ukraine, and it's interesting to compare that to how quick the Russians are trying to conquer Ukraine right now. Like, look how fast the Germans are conquering this. They're doing basically, I guess, blitzkrieg, but it's just weird to consider those two, because obviously Ukraine's a battleground here right now in this part of the front, and yeah, I don't know, just some interest. Then obviously the Germans going into this invasion are very well organized. They have a plan. They're sticking to the plan. They're doing really well, while the Soviets are completely caught off guard and are having clumsy reactions to the invasion.
Were facing a million
Right now, you would assume the Germans are going to win.
Soviet soldiers. In the beginning of the invasion, the Army Group Center was to encircle Soviet forces at the border and then advance towards Smolensk and Moscow. Meanwhile, Army Group North was to advance directly towards Leningrad, threatening to trap the Soviet forces between them and the sea. On June 22nd, the Germans attacked. The Soviet Western Front was deployed forward, and during the first days of the war, the German forces encircled most of its formations near the towns of Bialystok and Minsk. In the Baltics, the Soviet counterattacks were defeated in the Battle of Raseiniai, and then they attempted to pull back and establish a defensive line on Daugava River.
And like, judging by this map right here, there's almost no Soviet resistance. Like, I know the darker circles here are the tank units, while the gray are infantry. You can just see the Germans are steamrolling right now. And if I were even the Germans, I'd be like, okay, we're gonna win soon. They're not gonna last 3 months.
But the Germans reached the river before them and pushed onwards, threatening the Soviet units in the west with encirclement. At the same time, Army Group Center had finished encircling the Soviet Western Front, and its infantry units began to reduce the pockets, while its armored forces advanced eastwards almost unopposed. The Soviets attempted
and look at all these prisoners of war. Unstoppable.
Mark the gap by deploying most of their pre-war reserves to counter them, but it was not enough, and as the German offensive continued, their armor broke through the Soviet lines and trapped these units near Smolensk. By that time, the first wave of Soviet mobilization was complete, and the Soviets used these formations.
And I'm assuming the pre-war reserves are not trained well, considering they just spawned into existence on the map, but maybe they are.
To block further German advance and attempted to free the encircled troops. However, the performance of these newly created units was lackluster, and they were unable to liberate the pocket. The Germans managed to close it up and eliminate it. The Germans had gained the upper hand in the central part of the front, and now they were faced with two options. They could continue the push towards Moscow immediately,
Fuck, the amount of prisoners of wars they keep taking is way larger than the size of my city.
Was secure the flanks of Army Group Center first and then continue the offensive eastwards. They decided to do the latter, and the armored formations of Army Group Center were sent to aid neighboring army groups. During this time, battles had been raging.
I'm curious what you guys would do if you were a general or whatever. Would you continue to push towards Moscow right away, or would you spread out your forces and try to equal out the front on the north and south? I personally would. I'm more cautious of a person, so out of caution, I would probably try to send reinforcements to the north and south before I push towards Moscow. Um, yeah.
In the north, where Army Group North had failed to pull out large encirclements, and their progress was slowed down by the Soviet counterattacks and bad infrastructure. Nevertheless, they were making slow but steady progress, and after securing their left
It's actually surprising to me that the Nazis chose the more cautious route, considering they're so aggressive in nature.
they reached the approaches to Leningrad. When the help from Army Group Center arrived, they were able to perform the final push and cut off the land-based communications to the city. Further north, Finland had entered the war against the Soviet Union on June 25th, and the Finnish troops took advantage of the Soviet defeats by taking back the lands lost in the Winter War. After that, they established forward defensive positions between the lakes. Even further north, the Finnish and German troops attempted to capture the Soviet port city of Murmansk and cut the Murmansk railway in order to sever the Allied supply route to the Soviet Union. However, their attacks became bogged down in the rough terrain short of their objectives. The front became static. Meanwhile, the other armored units of the Army Group Center were sent to help Army Group South. The Soviets had anticipated that the Germans would continue their attack towards Moscow and
So I have a question about this. So the Murmansk Railway or whatever is how the Soviet Union got all of its aid from what, the United Kingdom and the United States? If the Germans were successful in cutting off this railway here, would this have changed the war significantly? I actually do not know, because I don't know how much of Allied arms the Soviet Union was using to help them out, to help themselves out. I know they had a formidable industry themselves, but I don't know if it was enough that they could have repelled the German invasion without the help of the Allies. So I am curious to know if the Germans had just sent an extra few units here or whatever and managed to cut this part off, would this have been significant in the war, or would it have just been, or would it have not changed the outcome?
concentrated their troops on this direction, which allowed the German armored formations to push back the weaker Soviet units on their southern flank. The German advance southwards forced the Soviets to abandon their forward positions in the Pripyat marshes to shorten their line. In Ukraine, the Soviet troops were occupying a strong defensive position, with their flanks resting on the Dnieper River in the west and south and the marshes in the north. Yet, the panzers from Army Group Center were bypassing the marshes from the east and advanced into the Soviet rear. The Soviets thought that the German spearhead was overextended and could be contained. However, unbeknownst to them, the armored formations of the Army Group South had secretly crossed the Dnieper from the south into a German breachhead and now broke through towards north to link up with the spearhead. As the groups met, most of the Soviet units in the central Ukraine became encircled. 750,000 men were trapped in the pocket. When the pocket had been liquidated, the Soviet forces in Ukraine had been severely weakened. After these operations, the flanks of Army Group Center were
665,000.
secure, but now the Germans didn't have enough time to reach the objectives set in the beginning of the campaign, and they decided to go for more limited goals. In order to reach them, they began a full-scale attack along the whole front. In the south, the Soviet resistance had been crippled with the recent encirclement, and this allowed the Germans to carry out another.
Okay, so the Germans weren't as efficient as they thought they would be, but there's no denying that from what we see here, it looks like overwhelming success on the German side. It took them longer than expected, but can you blame them for still thinking like, okay, we got this? And given their new goal, I believe they could achieve it easily.
Encirclement, trapping part of the Soviet forces on the coast of the Black Sea. Then they pushed onwards and established their
And I think you mentioned they assumed the Red Army was on the brink of collapse, and I also can't blame them for that because the Red Army's reaction so far has been really clumsy and disorganized and caught off guard. So you would assume that at this point it would kind of confirm the Nazi theory that Slavs are inherently subhuman, I guess, because the idea is, well, look at how they're defending themselves is going to be an easy conquest.
over the resource-rich areas of the eastern Ukraine and conquered the Crimean Peninsula, with Soviets abandoning Odessa but
Brutal.
clinging on to the port of Sevastopol. At the same time, the German forces were pursuing their objectives in the north. Their goal was to
Look how fast their conquering of Ukraine is compared to the Russo-Ukraine war we're seeing right now.
sever the remaining supply route to Leningrad and link up with the Finnish forces. The initial advance was successful and reached its first goal by cutting the railway line supplying the city. The main German effort was in the center. All this time the Soviets had anticipated an attack on Moscow and had deployed 1,250,000 mobilized troops to the sector. During the German operations on the flanks, they had even somewhat managed to push Army Group Center back to improve their defense.
Okay, so right now we're seeing, it looks like, I don't know how big Russian units are, so I don't know what these squares are compared to the circles or whatever, but it looks like the Russians have put up formidable defense in the center while the Germans were busy securing the north and south.
Perimeter, but by the end of September, the German armor had finally returned to the center and proceeded to carry out a new attack. Once again, near the towns of Vyazma and Bryansk, the Soviet troops were encircled, and this resulted in halving the Soviet strength on the front.
Well, the Germans obviously are numerically superior here.
After reducing the pockets, the Germans closed their distance to Moscow. Then they attempted to encircle Moscow with a two-pronged attack, but by that time the long advance had exhausted their offensive
That encirclement is insane. How are they not able to take Moscow after that? Look at this.
capabilities, and the weather had
Ridiculous.
become severely cold. The Soviets managed to halt their advance, and although they didn't have large superiority in numbers, the Soviet...
Okay, so we obviously know this doesn't work because, it's history. But how? It is so shocking to believe that the Germans weren't able to encircle and take Moscow by this point. Obviously, this map doesn't show everything. We're not seeing, supply drainage. We're not seeing, morale. We're not seeing fatigue of soldiers. But based off the map alone, come on, right? It feels like Moscow is destined to fall. And it doesn't happen.
Proficiency in winter combat allowed them to carry out a counterattack. The Germans were forced to abandon their vulnerable forward positions on the flanks and pulled back in order to shorten the front line. During the retreat, they had to abandon
They're so close, man.
of their heavy equipment. At the same time, the German attempt to cut off Leningrad had also failed.
This also feels like Germany's first L of the battle, of the war. All of a sudden, they're pushed back pretty dramatically from Moscow, and their great offensive is stopped in its tracks. And it feels like this is the first time in the battle it's happened, like in the war with the Soviet Union.
And they had to retreat to their starting positions, and the supply line to Leningrad was restored. In the south, the German advance was also checked by the Soviets, forcing the Germans to abandon their forward positions in Rostov. The first year of the war was over. The Soviets had stopped the Germans far from their initial goals, but at the great cost to their own military capabilities. The Red Army had been decimated, and it would take a year or more to fully rebuild and re-equip the army. The Germans wanted to use...
Okay, so winter was a big L for the Germans. They weren't proficient in winter combat, and I assume it's because the Soviet winter is more brutal than the German winter. So Russian soldiers are more used to these kinds of temperatures, I'm guessing. So yeah, I don't know.
This window of opportunity, and were sending most of their available forces to the Eastern Front to deliver a knockout punch in the following year. 1942 would be the decisive year of the war.
Okay, so yeah, I suppose the Germans didn't get nearly as far as they want to. I would still feel that the Germans were going to win this. If I had to guess, and I didn't obviously know the future, I would assume that the Germans are still destined to win this, even despite not getting as far as they wanted in their goals. I would assume in the spring they would be successful. Obviously, they're not, but they send all their available reinforcements to this line. But that's interesting because Germany is technically kind of fighting a two-front war, right? Yes, they can send a lot of their troops to this line, but they still have to fortify the coast in case of any attacks from the British or Americans, right? So Germany's put in this tricky situation. I'd be really curious to see if Germany could have beat the Soviet Union one-on-one if it wasn't at war with the British Empire and the United States at this point. I guess we'll never know, but I would still estimate that Germans are going to win this. But obviously that's not how it goes. But because despite the formidable numbers growing on the line on the Russian front, it still feels like they're broadly disorganized and under-equipped, or maybe not under-equipped, but underexperienced or whatever. The German war machine still feels pretty fierce at this point. I guess that's the end of the video, but obviously we know the Germans don't win, but it's understandable to assume they would have won, especially from their point of view. However, they didn't make the progress they wanted to make. But I think this is a really good video. It's such a unique way of viewing this war that we haven't seen historically. It really puts everything into perspective, and it really gives you like a overall view of how dramatic this war was, how big this war was, the stakes of this war. So yeah, I love this video, and I can only imagine the time and effort put into it. So it's interesting. It's a fun learning experience too. I don't think I have anything more to say than that. So goodbye, everyone.